what I've been learning and seeing about complexity theory and what many of you are familiar with in terms of strength-based change and appreciative inquiry, and maybe more generally just some of the traditional assumptions and values around organization development as a practice. So I'm going to go through several slides with different kinds of ideas, and as Kevin said, please at any time just jot down an observation, a thought, a question, a concern, whatever, and hopefully we'll, in about 30 minutes max, we'll be able to open up and respond and interact around some of those. So, oops, why isn't this? There we go, sorry. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the narrative these days that intentional change efforts in organizations are best attempts to try to evaluate long-term their success, have all sort of concluded with the idea that the success rate is only between 25 and 30% of the time. And while this research is difficult and is controversial, the fact that it comes from so many different fields and domains and avenues of study, I think is lending credence to the general conclusion. You can see here that TQM, strategic planning implementation, change management, McKinsey from a consulting perspective, they're all in their own ways trying to understand the long-term effectiveness, and they're all coming up with these relatively similar findings. This one down at the bottom from PricewaterhouseCoopers, research shows nearly 75% of all organization change programs fail, not because leadership didn't adequately address infrastructure, process, IT, etc., but because they didn't create the necessary groundswell of support among employees. So that rings familiar to anybody who's familiar or practicing anything related to organization development. We've always stood for working with the client system in ways that they optimize buy-in, commitment, and so forth. So it's not surprising to hear this, but it may come as a bit of a shock to the field of OD that we're not making perhaps a bigger impact or better impact. So I've been using this slide often in classrooms where, you know, just asking people to guess how successful change rates are and change efforts are. And this notion of a hammer and nail is just a metaphor that I've always found sort of appropriate, that we have a particular way of looking at most situations that we think need change or improvement. And because we have that familiar way and because we're good at it, we tend to throw it at everything. So, you know, if you learn to use a hammer and you like a hammer and you enjoy using it, then you start looking for nails. You start looking for things to use that hammer on. So the hammer itself, what could that be? Well, we could debate that for a long time. We'd have a very interesting conversation, I'm sure, about that. But this idea here that change initiatives based on new analytic tools and problem-solving approaches are still introduced and managed in the same way as prior to those tools and approaches. So people are expected to think and behave differently with new tools, but in the same workplace culture. So that's at least one possible explanation for why we're only getting the 25 or 30% success rate. Our sense, as many of you would know from the appreciative inquiry approach that we developed here, We think that this hammer, the thing that doesn't change in the introduction of new SAP systems or ERP systems or IT systems or whatever it is, what doesn't change is the fundamental gap or deficit approach. That management used that before, they use it during, and they use it after. And so one of our sort of propositions is that the best problem solving and gap analytic tools are never going to change culture, create high engagement, unleash innovation, or align everyone around high purpose. They will improve certain processes and procedures that are well defined and not subject to too much variation. They'll definitely improve those, but they were never intended to work on system-wide adoption of things, where culture matters, where you want high engagement, where you want people to be more innovative or creative, or where you wish for a larger group or a critical mass to align around a high purpose. Those gap analytic tools were never designed for those kinds of changes, but we use that mindset typically in creating or managing those kind of changes. So the piece that I wanted to introduce and add on to this discussion has to do with where those gap analytic tools and change methods came from. So one more piece of the hammer, so to speak, using that analogy, is that most of the tools that we turn to today for leading or facilitating intentional change come from legacy theory. That means theory and methods that were derived from studying organizations that thrived or failed in a very different context, meaning decades ago. Talking 30, 40, 50 years ago, the world of organizations was arguably very, very different. But the primary tools that we use today, for example, Kotter's 8-step or 8 factors for successful change, which is actually based on unfreezing, change, refreezing, a much older Lewinian concept, which was the foundation of organization development practice. Those ideas came in a very different world. So I came across some colleagues at Ashridge University in the UK, and some of you that were in the early years of MPOD, we included a visit to Ashridge on our international study tour for about 4 or 5 years. And the colleagues I met there were working with ideas from Ralph Stacey having to do with complexity theory. And they were also practicing with AI and other OD interventions. And these slides, the next several slides that I'm going to talk to, are adaptations of some of their work and some of their application of Stacey's basic kind of complexity notions. So on this slide, you've got 2 dimensions, one around agreement or alignment and one around certainty and uncertainty. So what I'm calling the legacy theories come from looking at organizations and intervening in organizations where the general context, you didn't expect a lot of disagreement around the preferred method or the preferred strategy or the preferred approach to take. You also didn't expect high uncertainty in terms of predicting the environment. So those were the days where strategic plans really were 5-year plans. Product life cycles were in 3 to 5 years, not 3 to 5 months like they are today, or even less. So you had higher agreement, less diversity of opinion and views, and higher clarity and certainty about the future, less uncertainty. So if you imagine the 2 dimensions, If you're in that high area, then you're really focused on managing and improving the status quo, incrementalism, because you can predict and forecast what's likely to happen if you do A or B, and then you choose one, and you're more likely to agree on that choice. And so you work in that kind of context. The other end of that, high uncertainty and high disagreement or diversity of views and opinions, is arguably nothing to do with managing and improving the status quo. Partly because the status quo just doesn't exist for very long. It's continually changing, emerging, morphing, and so forth. So there we see terms like co-creation and transformation. And my proposition in this whole conversation today is that our fundamental OD tools weren't designed to work in this context. And this is the context that we're facing more and more today. So taking the same notion, if you're in the high agreement, high clarity, or high certainty domain, then the focus is legitimately on procedures, performance management, measurement, risk management, correcting human reaction or human variance to systems and process. And that's what planned change is fundamentally been about for decades. In the other domain or the other context, the high uncertainty and higher disagreement or diversity of views, you see what sounds much more modern and what you're hearing today a lot. Increased flow of information, challenging habits and assumptions continuously, more connectivity socially and technically, more diversity of the mind, less power differentials, and an emphasis on presence or mindfulness. These all sort of make sense in this kind of constantly shifting, changing, uncertain context. They don't make a lot of sense if you're down in the high agreement or high clarity and high agreement and high clarity and certainty. So again, it's kind of a contrast or a paradox now for somebody wanting to lead or facilitate change. The context obviously is not black or white. It's not either or, it's a mixture of this. But I think most of our popular tools and approaches are really centered on the lower left here, the higher agreement and the higher clarity and certainty. So just to go a little bit into the roots of the high clarity, high agreement, high clarity and certainty, you're all familiar with the, again, the legacy idea of scientific management. And it very much proposes that we design and set in place procedures, roles, structures, etc. So process and structure change or creation leads to people behaving differently and producing different results. And so the fundamental notion is that organization and change can be planned, controlled, and re-engineered. You all remember, well, many of you would remember the popular bestsellers back in the 80s and early 90s, Re-Engineering the Corporation. That mindset is still with us in Six Sigma, lean manufacturing, etc. Those are all incremental improvement tools based on defining gaps or variances from the designed intention. But the idea behind that is that we design it, put people in it, and then keep correcting people's behavior by retweaking the design. And that, you know, that's the mechanistic or the kind of the machine metaphor of organizations. But I believe it's at the root of even our relationally oriented old OD practices, that we're still thinking that we can control outcomes by designing the right process. The process can be technical or social, and or social, but it still is this, it starts with design and creation of structures and roles and so forth, and then people act into that and they change as a result. So in OD, we think about organizations, and we have thought about organizations as more complex than that, of course. OD arguably is one of the reactions to the scientific management approach. So we do know, or we have acknowledged, that there is a formality to organization life, that there are stated goals and policies, systems and procedures, structures, and role relationships. We don't deny that, we accept that, but we do go further. I mean, we also accept and amplify often that organizations are social settings, that there are relations going on, that people work, not totally, but to a large majority, they work and get things done through relationships. So there's a social aspect. And within that social aspect, there's an acknowledgement that there's a certain formality, but there's also always an accompanying informality. Sometimes people call that the shadow organization. So from the informal perspective, it's all about what and who you really need to know. Informal opinion leaders, self-organizing that happens in addition or as a reaction to the prescribed roles and so forth. Networks that form. So in OD, we've always accepted that there's this mix. There's the formal, the informal, or there's the apparent and the shadow. I think the challenge to a lot of our change theory and change methods is that they're not geared to intervene into both the formal and the informal, or to somehow embrace both. They're very, very driven toward the formal part of the organization. And of course, any intervention in the formal part will obviously create reactions and consequences in the informal part. So this other view, based on Stacy's work that my colleagues at Ashridge are working with, they call complex social process, that organizations are at their very root complex, they call it responsive process. And it's an alternate view from the scientific management for sure. And I'm just going to go through a couple of the headlines here. So the core assertion from this perspective is organizations are nothing more than human beings in an ongoing process of interaction. Thereby, they're affecting and they're affected by their environment, but the environment is primarily this environment of interactions. And because it's this complex mix or variety of interactions, they're not in control. I'll come back to that in a moment. So organization, what we call organization, emerges in the patterns and flows of communication as people, quote, go on, unquote, together. So there's this emergent kind of notion here that everything in organizations is rooted in conversation. There's tons of conversations happening simultaneously, so nobody can be in control of all those conversations. And because of the conversational nature, much more of it is emerging or being co-created in the moment rather than being prescribed, pre-designed, engineered, etc. And the other notion of complexity theory is that at some perspective, patterns emerge in all chaotic phenomenon. at some perspective, some distance, for example, watching birds fly, you see patterns. So patterns will emerge. And from this view, the patterns that emerge and then, of course, change over time are what we call organization, what looks like an organized effort. So one of the propositions here that's important is order emerges out of chaos without external design agency. You don't create order, order emerges, and it's very temporal. So it means that we have to pay more attention to self-organization, the whole notion of emergence, what's emerging in the informal, in the shadow, that is then having a consequence on what we call the formal. What kind of patterns are emerging? And in thinking or looking at those things, what you're doing is you're sort of sitting in the middle of stability and instability at the same time. You're embracing both. You're not trying to minimize instability or maximize order. You are simply accepting or not accepting. You're simply appreciating and working in the midst of both and accepting that both are there. There's, at any point in time, there are certain patterns which create some stability. And then there is also instability, which is going to have a consequence on those patterns. So the sort of insight that at least I got from this is that social processes are inherently uncontrollable and unpredictable. In appreciative inquiry, we talk about social constructionism, this idea of words create worlds, that we go in the direction of what we most frequently converse about, and particularly what we ask questions about. And this is not different. It's simply pointing out that, and if we do that, we're not in control. We can't predict, because each conversation is its own creative moment or spontaneous moment of seeing, do we have shared meaning or not? Do we have different views, or do we have alignment or not alignment? So another lens on, or another implication of this, when you look into your organization or any part of your organization, you just look. What do you actually see? What are you seeing when you look at people in the organization? I would say, you see people doing work, talking to people, reading, meeting, interacting with machines, moving around. A whole lot of ing, I-N-G. And this is another implication of this perspective, that there really isn't organization, there's organizing, there's teaming. It's a process view, and it actually calls for a different language. There's not structure, there's structuring. There's not plans, there's planning. Almost everything you can imagine can become a verb. And it's important because when we make things nouns, which we have, I was trained in OD over 40 years ago, and we talk about the client system, the change, the project. When you objectify those things, you distance yourself as if the subject-object distinction in the physical sciences. So the idea is, well, I can call, there is a structure, there is a plan, there is a project, and if I'm distanced from it, subject-object difference, then I can tweak it, I can design, I can intervene, and I can shape it. When in fact, from this perspective, we're all part of it. There's no separation of subject and object. The object is simply the consequence in the moment of all these conversations happening. So there's no way that you can control it or put boundaries around it. So one of the offshoots of this flow of thinking is that You need to pay more attention and appreciate more the exceptions, the things that look less formal, more emergent, more self-organized, or the consequence of non-role prescribed interaction. So novelty emerges through misunderstanding, mistakes, disturbance, messiness. The exceptions or the differences can be the generative root of change. Some of you would be familiar with Frank Barrett's book, Say Yes to the Mess, where he poses what we can learn from jazz improvisation, the process of jazz improvisation for organizations who are trying to be more innovative. I think it implies something for consultants or change agents, that we have a choice almost moment to moment to dampen or amplify an exception, to dampen or amplify a difference. So for example, in appreciative inquiry seeks to amplify positive exceptions, positive differences. That's really what it's doing. I'm not arguing that all the differences have to be positive. I'm just saying that it's the exceptions, the surprises, and potentially the mistakes that can become moments of new emergent meaning making, and then consequence to that, emerging patterns. So key ideas: conversation is the core process. The meaning of the gesture is in the response. So if conversation is really the core, really at the heart of all organizing, whether we're talking about businesses or families, communities, whatever, then it's important to break that down. What is a conversation? A conversation is a gesture, and then a response to that gesture, and then a response to that response. The meaning of the gesture is not in, when I make it, what I intend it to mean. The meaning only comes as a result of how you react to it, and then I begin to react to your reaction. Then we're in a search or even a dance for shared meaning, an exploration for shared meaning. But this idea that I control your behavior by the certain gesture I make is just, from this lens, from this perspective, it's just, it's a myth. It's crazy to think that. So now we get to really pushing on people's comfort zone. The next logical conclusion then, if conversation is the core process and the meaning of a gesture is in the response, then managers can be in charge, but they can never be in control. Leaders can be in charge, and they can be highly influential, but they can never be in control because they cannot control the response. They can't control how you perceive what they say. So, again, this idea that we can engineer, design processes that make people be a certain way, or that we can, because of our being in charge in a certain position, say something to somebody and they will behave accordingly. That's the idea of control. It just doesn't hold out in terms of real life in organizations. Margaret Wheatley wrote quite a while ago, there's no more powerful way to initiate a significant change than to convene a conversation. So she's coming from the same kind of idea that conversation is at the root of everything. And if you want to start to change something, as we've said for years in the AI literature, if you want to start to change something, change the way you're talking about it. Ask a different question, but convene and change the way you're conversing about it. So what I want to argue is that from this perspective of complex social process, we in OD need to attend more to self-organizing processes, emerging patterns, and local interaction. Self-organizing, emerging patterns, and local interaction. Less on the formal, you know, the view of the organization that has to do with structure, budget, roles, positions, and more on what else is going on, because there's a lot of self-organizing, emerging patterns in the local interaction continuously. That's the shadow side that we talked about earlier. It doesn't mean bad or dark. It just means it's the non-formal. All formal lives with informal or non-formal. The social construction view that I mentioned, when you put this together and compare it back to that scientific management slide, it's just totally the reverse. We start with self-organizing collaborative action. That's what gets shared results or shared outputs or completion of projects, things like that. If you start there, looking at the self-organizing and collaboration that's happening, then you see people behaving differently and producing different results. That leads to patterns and emergent process and structures. So what we call the formal is actually the consequence of the informal, the chaotic, complex network of conversations out of which always will emerge certain patterns for a certain amount of time. There's one more slide here just to emphasize the implication of this on our language. Again, this is consistent with social construction as a starting point, that words matter, that language is our key vehicle for creating or searching for shared meaning. So in that high agreement, high clarity, and certainty context, we read about and we use these terms all the time: the system, the organization, the change, the leader, the project, the study. In the high uncertainty, high diversity of opinion and views context, it's organizing, changing, leading, designing, inquiring, being. Everything is in motion. Everything is continuously existing and living. So again, back to the fundamental starting point, if we were working in organization settings or within an organization in a setting where there's a tendency to high agreement and high clarity and certainty, then the focus legitimately, I think, is on managing and improving the status quo. So you see a pull toward bureaucracy. You see a pull toward what we've called command and control. And it makes sense. It's not a good, bad question. Those kinds of tactics or those kinds of language even, they make sense. But they don't make sense, again, for the higher uncertainty, higher diversity of views context. There, if we're creating transformation, then we need to embrace complexity. We need to embrace ambiguity. We need to accept volatile changes and patterns in our environment. We need to be more fast-paced, and we need to accept the growing diversity of the mind. That more and more people need to be aligned with something, but the fact that we need more and more means we have to really live and be more comfortable with diversity. The good news is that we, I think, can show through case studies now that appreciative inquiry, our sort of dominant change method and theory that we put in the MPOD program these days, it works in both contexts. Some of the early stories some of you would have heard in the class if you were at least in the MPOD era, the Navy and trucking companies and so forth. That's very much working down in the higher agreement, higher clarity and certainty context. Forming the United Religions, working with the UN Global Compact, working with Walmart's supply chain to change the entire textile industry to organic cotton. That's more in the creating transformation. That's up there where there's a high diversity of opinions and high uncertainty in terms of predicting much, if at all, if anything, in the larger environment. So there's hope in the sense that perhaps AI is an example of a method and tool that helps us balance or helps us sit in the midst of this larger domain now, as opposed to just the legacy domain or the legacy theories that really were born out of one part of this domain, the high agreement, high clarity and certainty. So just let me restate a couple of the ideas, and then hopefully some of you have chimed in on the comments section and we can respond to some things. So I've got a couple of summary slides here. Organizations are not separate things. So let's just start with that. From a complex social process view, organizations are networks or webs of multiple conversations happening continuously. Conversation is the core process of organizing. Everything comes from conversation. Future is emerging from the intentions, decisions, and actions in the present. Future is not created by reacting to the past. It's coming from decisions and actions in the present. Those are shaped by the past, perhaps, not always, but it's not a reactive view. It's a proactive view. We are living into our futures through our conversations. Causality is complex, not linear or predictable. Leaders are in charge, but not in control. And change happens at a local level, nose to nose. Even in our AI work with large summits with hundreds of people, even thousands in a few cases, everything still is face-to-face, meaning it starts with one-on-one interviews, it builds through small group conversations. There's a growing shared meaning that's emerging out of those conversations and common ground that's discovered, but it's still local. Everything is happening from the starting point of conversation. Some implications for leadership and leading change. Real change arises through working with the informal process rather than through formal change management. I think the whole field of OD needs to embrace more and help leaders embrace more the informal that has to coexist with the formal. Control is an illusion. Accept unpredictability. This means giving up the need to be right. That's a tough one for everybody. The facilitator, the leader, the employee, the so-called expert. But it comes from this realization, control really is an illusion. You can only control your initial gesture. After that, everything is being co-created, everything. So we have to accept that that's, at least to some degree, unpredictable. And this means letting go of this need to be right or need to make the other person right. Conversation is the only game in town, similar to the other slide. There's no such thing as objectivity. No one person is ever right or wrong. It's always owned in conversation and in relationship. Legislating for every eventuality stops innovation. I think we all have experienced this, but again, organizations want to formalize everything or they want to introduce a formal system to create innovation. It's just backwards. Look at how people are innovating. Patterns will emerge. See if the patterns are serving you. If they're not, change the conversations and see what else emerges. And lastly, unintended consequences are normal and inevitable. Everything has a consequence and an unintended consequence, just like all formality exists with informality and vice versa. So we need to be more just open or receptive or attentive to unintended consequences, not as mistakes or as things to avoid, but more for opportunities for more conversation, opportunities for more inquiry. And then my last slide here is about moving out of the comfort zone. Of all the stuff I've said, I think the three things that are most likely to shake any of us up the first time we hear it, and this is true for me the first time I was exposed to these ideas. So grand generalizations like value statements, strategic plans, mission statements, even vision statements are only useful when they are localized. Most leaders see the need for vision, value, mission, things like that. But then they get caught into they should come up with it, they should announce it. Once they announce it, it's there. This says that those things have no use really until they're localized, until they're mentioned in conversation, daily, hourly, related to work, related to a problem at work. And you mention a strategic goal or you mention a core value, then it is in vivo, then it's living in that conversation. Otherwise, those generalizations have no real value. The people who came up with those statements, it has value simply because it's an emergent pattern from their conversations. The next one, nothing ever works the same way twice, so best practice is an illusion. We still do a lot of consulting based on best practices, industry benchmarking, and we just believe that search for the best or the most right or the most often correct solution is the way to go, because we believe we can control the implementation of that locally. So from this view, that is just upside down. Nothing ever works the same way twice. It's always the result of emergent local conversation. And then the last 100 objective measurements can never sum up the worth of a garden. So this slide is just sort of saying, you know, grand generalizations, best practice, and measurement are sort of danger zones. We tend to look at those as if they are shaping something rather than they're simply today's emergent pattern out of conversation. And different conversation can change them tomorrow. So for any of you listening, if you're intrigued at all, kind of practical implications of this in our work, whether we're in a facilitating role or a parenting or whatever that role might be. One would be to convene conversations across boundaries, to convene more conversations across, quote, the formal boundaries. Articulate, meaning localize what you see as strategic priorities and systems constraints. Bring those into conversations more, as opposed to assuming that everybody is aware of them and somehow guided by them. Bring them specifically and literally into the conversation. Legitimize differences of view and challenge norms. Appreciate the exceptions would be another way to say that. appreciate negative deviance and appreciate positive deviance. Put attention or put value on it as important to look into and discuss. Encourage people who break norms and rules to try to do something new. Innovating, even if it looks like it's a bad reaction to a formal request or a formal policy, people are adapting and coping all the time, and we just don't put our lens on it. We don't put a valuing eye on it to see what could we learn or what patterns might be in that, quote, informal reaction to something that could be useful patterns going forward. Play in the informal process, join, participate, empower. Leaders get trapped unintentionally, I think, for the most part. They get trapped in their role. You know, I need to look, sound, and be a certain way. And that seldom allows them to feel comfortable in more informal processes where they don't have the answers. They may not know what all the right questions are, and they just join in. They just get into the conversation. And hold the paradox of stability and novelty simultaneously. I think that's something that appreciative inquiry has done a good job with, building the positive core as a stable factor that you can hold on to in order to then face the unknown with a more positive and constructive attitude or mindset. There's 3 books that I would recommend. Again, if you're interested or at all tweaked by some of these ideas. On the left here, Leadership and Cultural Webs in Organizations, Weaver's Tales by Adrian McLean. Adrian was one of the Ashridge faculty who worked with our MPODs for several years, and we still have him come and visit in our last residency. And he's been able to really couple up appreciative inquiry and methods like that with this complex social process perspective. The book in the middle, Patricia Shaw, Changing Conversations in Organizations. This is a OD, I mean, she doesn't call herself OD. She's a change agent consultant, and she writes and explains with tremendous detail and insight about how she applies this and gets paid for it, literally. How she helps organizations just open up conversation, and that you don't know what the conclusion's going to be. You don't even know if there's going to be a conclusion, but you begin to change the way conversations are happening, and out of that, new patterns emerge, new differences are appreciated, and so forth. It's a really, really interesting book, and for me, the first time I looked at it, I had a very hard time getting through it. I just kept saying no, and it really turned some of my ideas upside down. And then I mentioned earlier Frank Barrett's book, Say Yes to the Mess, the lessons from improv and jazz. It's just a great book for, again, looking at organizations as organizing through conversation and through gesture and response. So with that, Kevin, I will turn it over to you and see if there's any quick things I could react to. All right?
Sounds good. Thank you so much for that presentation. There was one question that came in that got some communication going in the chat room about what about complexity at scale? Zappos tried holacracy, but it didn't seem to work. Is that similar to what is being suggested?
I don't think so. I'm not a big, I wouldn't say I'm very knowledgeable on holacracy, but I think like a lot of, quote, models, holacracy is now a solution. So it's like, okay, it's something that we can go and create. It may be very mobile, facile, it may be very conversational, it may be very egalitarian. You know, it may be tied to some really good values, but again, the way we're using it, it's like it's a new solution, it's a new model. So now we're going to go create that, and that whole "we're going to create" is a trap, because it's getting us back into the old thinking.
Another question was, what is the balance of design and intentionality versus serendipity or chance as it relates to organizations?
From this view, it's what was it? Design and what on the one side? What
design and intentionality.
Intentionality. Yeah. So I think two things. It's more about the serendipity and chance than we currently are comfortable with, for sure. And I don't think anybody is saying that we don't try to design or formalize some of the emergent patterns that are most successful. But when we formalize them through design or intention, we also have to accept that they're still temporal. They're still subject to continuous meaning-making, unmeaning-making, that conversations will always be testing, questioning, as well as implementing those emergent things that we could say we designed or we have institutionalized or routinized. So it's a little bit, it's like designing can be going on, but the design is dangerous. Intentionality, it goes back to gesture. We manifest our intentionality through the gesture we make, the opening, the question we start a conversation with, the announcement we start with, the brief speech we give before the meeting agenda. That's where our intention is manifested, in the gesture. But the meaning and the consequence of that only happens after and through responses. So the intention cannot by itself create the outcome.
There was also a question from Paul sort of around how to translate this. So he said, I'm curious about translating this, which I understand and agree with wholeheartedly, to CEOs and other executives in organizations who would benefit from this type of change. In the era of big data, the notion of measurement being a danger zone is very provocative. I'd be very interested in how that idea lands in conversations with executives.
Yeah, it's a good point. This big data is so popular. We're just about to add a whole new course in our MBA on data analytics, and you know, I don't know the best way to get into those conversations, but where I've had some success, if you want to call it that, in just kind of softening that heavy data analytic view is simply around, you know, having two or more executives look at the same spreadsheet or the same whatever data presentation, and just hearing the different interpretations they're making. That the data itself is not certain, you know, it's not right or wrong, and it's not good or bad. It's the fact that for anything to happen as a result of that, there has to be some shared meaning. And that's where I think leaders are often impatient, or they just presume that their meaning is the meaning. So, yeah, to Paul, I think just literally trying to have a conversation about that. You know, when have they experienced intentions really leading to positive outcomes, and what do they think was going on, and what did they observe? And I mean, it's not different really from the sort of generic AI question about when things have worked best. What do you think is really going on? What do you remember seeing or observing? and just pointing out that most of the time what they describe is exactly what is in a lot of these slides. It's not the fact that the plan was correct or that the engineers came up with the right recommendation. It's more about the people who got around it, how they worked with each other, how they modified it, how they improvised and somewhat self-organized to make it work. So yeah, it's a good question. And I do agree that it's part of the challenge given our infatuation now with big data.
So we have about 2 minutes left, so I'll give you one more question, and then you can have any closing comments.
Sure.
So the question is, what do you think about the shifting implications of belonging, or what it means to belong in these more complex and transforming environments?
If I may be reading into that. I don't think, I think organization identity is important, but organization identity can be associated with an image of a high purpose or a high vision, not to a paycheck, not to years in the organization. I think from this perspective, I'm just thinking out loud now, really, maybe it's more about belonging to certain conversations, belonging to certain relationships that hold value, hold meaning, challenge me, help me grow, and make me feel included or belonged. It might be much more belonging to a subset of fairly frequent conversations. So that might end up looking like a group or an informal group or a community of practice within an organization. It might end up looking like the same group as my branch office. So it looks like it's more of an organizationally connected thing that I belong to. But it's, I think it's the conversation that does or doesn't make us feel included. And we eventually, when we say we identify strongly with the organization, that could be the purpose, could be values, but those are going to be experienced through people, through different people talking about those things.
Great. Well, I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say thank you so much, Ron, for your time. You're getting a couple of thank yous in the chat as well. So thank you for everyone that participated today. I will have this recording up on YouTube for anyone who wants to rewatch it. And I look forward to seeing everyone at next month's meeting.
Yep, me too. Thank you, everybody. Good to see some of the names on the list. Names from the past. It's great to connect with you, at least in this way. So take care.